Welcome to the deep dive. I'm just so thrilled you're joining us today because the history we have lined up is absolutely staggering.
Oh, it really is. It's a fantastic topic.
Right. Today, we are immersing ourselves in a comprehensive Wikipedia article detailing the history of the VAD. And if you haven't come across that acronym before, it stands for the Voluntary Aid Detachment.
A completely crucial organization.
Exactly. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore how a group of, well, primarily untrained upper-class civilian volunteers stepped directly into the horrific realities of the First and Second World Wars.
And it completely held their own.
Yes. We're going to look at how they revolutionized military nursing, the grueling medical realities they faced, and, the intense class and professional friction they sparked along the way.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start with the origins,
Hmm.
right at the dawn of the 20th century. Set the scene for us.
Sure. So to really understand the VAD, you have to look at the anxiety simmering in Britain before the First World War. It's 1909.
The British War Office is looking at the shifting political landscape in Europe, and they realize they have a massive vulnerability.
A medical vulnerability.
Right. If a major war breaks out, their medical corps will be completely overwhelmed. So they request the creation of supplementary volunteer force. Two major organizations step up to build it: the British Red Cross and the Order of St. John.
Which was an ancient charity organization, right? Deeply focused on first aid and community health care.
Exactly. Together, they create the Voluntary Aid Detachment.
And the response from the public was massive, wasn't it? I mean, we're talking about a time when patriotism was a profound societal driving force.
Massive is almost an understatement here. By the summer of 1914, just as the world is teetering on the edge of the First World War, there are over 2,500 detachments scattered across Britain.
That is wild.
It translates to roughly 74,000 individual members. But the demographic breakdown of those 74,000 people is the linchpin of this entire story. Two-thirds of them were women and girls.
And we aren't talking about working-class women who were used to grueling physical labor.
Far from it, the vast majority of these female volunteers came from middle and upper-class backgrounds. We are talking about Edwardian Britain.
The era of corsets in high society.
Yes, women of this social standing led highly sheltered, structured, and heavily chaperoned lives. They had servants to light their fires, cook their meals, wash their clothes. The concept of actual physical hardship was entirely foreign to them.
So August 1914 rolls around, war breaks out, and you have tens of thousands of these sheltered aristocratic women enthusiastically waving their hands, ready to deploy. I have to imagine the military establishment welcomed them with open arms.
Not even remotely.
Really?
The British Red Cross was incredibly reluctant to let civilian women anywhere near overseas hospitals. And the military authorities flatly refused. They barred VADs from getting anywhere near the front lines.
Wait, I have to stop you there. That makes absolutely no logistical sense. You have a global war breaking out, a desperate need for medical support, and the military is actively turning away tens of thousands of eager, free volunteers. Why would they do that?
What's fascinating here is the deep irony of the military's mindset at the time. The establishment looked at these women and saw a massive liability.
A liability?
Yeah, they viewed them as entirely too privileged, too delicate, and too emotionally fragile for the grim realities of war. The assumption was that the moment an Edwardian socialite saw a gruesome artillery wound, she would simply faint or have a hysterical breakdown.
Right, the classic Victorian swoon.
Exactly. Plus, military hospitals run on rigid, unquestioning discipline. Generals assumed aristocratic women who were used to giving orders rather than taking them would be impossible to manage.
It is wild to put yourself in those shoes. I want you to just imagine that for a second. Imagine stepping out of a life of absolute luxury, where your biggest concern is a dinner party arrangement, and trying to force your way into a gritty, high-stakes war ward, only to have a general tell you to go back to your parlor because you're too posh to help.
It was incredibly frustrating for them.
Yeah.
Initially, they were officially restricted to just one local hospital back home. They weren't even allowed to travel.
But they didn't just accept that, did they?
No, you see them bending the rules right away. Many started working unofficially, just for a few days at a time, at various hospitals in their local areas to get around the red tape. It actually ended up providing a weird sort of continuity of care for patients who were being transferred between facilities.
But history rarely tolerates the status quo for long, especially in wartime. There is always a catalyst that shatters those entrenched barriers.
And in this case, that catalyst was a woman named Catherine Furse.
Right. We are in October 1914. The war is only months old, but the casualties are already mounting at a terrifying rate. Catherine first pushes back against the War Office, and she manages to get a deployment of VADs over to France. But the numbers are shocking. How many did she actually get across the channel?
2.
Just 2.
Out of a force of tens of thousands, she managed to get 2 individual VADs to France.
Mm.
And even then, the military authorities placed a massive caveat on their presence. They were strictly restricted to serving as canteen workers and cooks.
They essentially benched them.
Yes. Under no circumstances were they allowed inside the medical tents.
Here's where it gets really interesting. War doesn't care about military red tape or gender expectations. While these 2 women are deployed as cooks, a sudden, unexpected battle erupts right on their doorstep. Casualties start flooding into the camp.
It was chaos.
Total chaos. The medical staff is completely overwhelmed, and there's simply no one else to help triage the bleeding soldiers.
So the commanders have a choice. Let men bleed out or let the cooks into the trauma ward.
And they chose the latter.
They did. These 2 VADs were abruptly pressed into emergency hospital service under actual artillery fire.
And what happens? Do they faint? Do they panic like the generals predicted?
They absolutely hold their ground. Historical accounts from that specific incident make it clear that they performed exceptionally well. They didn't collapse from the stress. They stepped directly into the gore, the noise, the chaos, and they completely shattered that entrenched, patriarchal assumption that upper-class civilian women couldn't handle the trauma of a battlefield.
It is the ultimate baptism by fire. You're literally boiling water for tea 1 minute, and the next you're holding down a soldier with a shrapnel wound while a surgeon works frantically.
And we really need to pause and emphasize what that medical reality looked like, because it is crucial to understanding how they revolutionized nursing. This wasn't just changing bandages on clean wounds.
No, not at all.
The VADs were suddenly exposed to conditions that would traumatize anyone. We are talking about the smell of gangrene filling the tents. They were dealing with soldiers suffering from trench foot, where the tissue was literally rotting away.
Just horrific stuff.
They were assisting in rapid, brutal amputations, often dealing with the agonizing effects of mustard gas, and later on, the horrific respiratory collapse caused by the Spanish flu.
Just the sheer physical toll of that is unimaginable. Standing on your feet for 18 hours in a damp, freezing tent, covered in blood, scrubbing floors when you had never even washed your own clothes before the war.
Which is exactly why that October 1914 incident changed everything. They proved they possessed the physical and mental fortitude required for the job. And frankly, the military was running out of options.
Because of the casualties.
Right. There was a rapidly growing shortage of trained professional nurses. The overseas hospitals desperately needed hands. Because of how those volunteers performed under fire, Catherine first was officially appointed commander-in-chief of the detachments. The floodgates finally opened.
What did those new rules look like? Did they just let anyone deploy at that point?
Not quite anyone. They implemented a standard. If a female volunteer was over the age of 23 and had more than 3 months of hospital experience, she was finally accepted for overseas service.
And once those restrictions were lifted, the geographic footprint of this organization just exploded. They weren't just huddled in a few tents in France anymore.
They were everywhere. They served extensively near the Western Front, of course, but you also find records of VADs deployed to Mesopotamia, the disastrous campaign at Gallipoli, and eventually the Eastern Front.
Wow.
And their roles expanded dramatically. Yes, bedside aid was their primary function, but they were also trained as ambulance drivers navigating completely cratered, bombed-out roads.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Very. They were acting as administrators, pharmacist assistants, cooks. They essentially became the logistical and supportive glue holding the military healthcare system together across multiple continents.
Which brings us to the sheer scale of the operation. By 1916, to give you an idea of the logistics, military hospitals back in Britain were employing about 8,000 trained nurses, managing roughly 126,000 beds. Abroad, there were 4,000 trained nurses handling 93,000 beds. But the VAD numbers just dwarf those professional figures.
You really do. By 1918, the Voluntary Aid Detachment had swelled to about 80,000 members. Roughly 12,000 of them were acting directly as nurses in military hospitals.
And we should clarify something here. The historical records often differentiate between military hospitals and auxiliary hospitals. What exactly was the difference for these women?
It's a great distinction to make. Military hospitals were directly run by the Army. They were strict, highly disciplined, and usually located near the front lines or major transit hubs. Auxiliary hospitals, on the other hand, were often stately homes, manors, or public buildings back in Britain that had been hastily converted into convalescent wards. These were mostly run by the Red Cross and heavily staffed by the VADs. In fact, by the end of the war, a massive 60,000 VADs were unpaid volunteers working in these auxiliary settings, caring for soldiers who were recovering from long-term injuries.
Okay, so you have this sudden, massive influx of untrained upper-class women pouring into highly structured medical environments. I have to imagine that working alongside the seasoned professional nurses wasn't exactly a harmonious experience.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see exactly why this dynamic was an absolute powder keg. You have to look at the history of professional nursing. Before Florence Nightingale in the late 19th century, nursing was largely seen as a menial working-class domestic job.
Right.
The professional nurses of 1914 had fought tooth and nail for decades to elevate their profession, to establish rigorous training standards, and to be respected as medical experts.
And suddenly, thousands of wealthy aristocrats swoop in wearing bespoke uniforms, treating the hospital like a charity gala.
Exactly the perception. The workplace drama was incredibly intense. On one side, the accounts note that many VAD volunteers brought a distinctly snobbish attitude to the wards. You have wealthy women, accustomed to commanding a household staff, suddenly finding themselves at the very bottom of the hospital hierarchy, being ordered to scrub bedpans by working-class professionals.
Have you ever been in a workplace where outsiders with vastly different backgrounds clash with seasoned professionals? I think we have all experienced some version of that culture clash where the new folks clash with the old guard, now amplify that tension by 1,000 and put it under the life or death stakes of a global war. Surely the trained nurses were at least a little grateful for the extra hands.
Initially, they were deeply resentful. The professionals saw the VADs as a threat. They lacked advanced medical skills. They often lacked the strict discipline required to prevent infection in a ward. And the professionals feared these wealthy volunteers would undermine all the progress they had made in legitimizing nursing as a paid career.
And I'm guessing the VADs didn't just quietly take the scolding.
Definitely not.
Hmm.
They were highly critical of the nursing profession's rigid hierarchies and what they saw as unnecessary bureaucracy.
It sounds completely dysfunctional. How did they ever manage to treat anyone with all that infighting?
Sheer trauma is an incredibly effective equalizer. As the war stretched on for 4 grueling years, that friction slowly gave way to mutual reliance. The VAD members learned quickly through relentless, brutal hands-on experience. They stopped being sheltered socialites and became hardened medical workers.
They earned their stripes.
They really did. And as they proved their unquestionable competence under fire, the trained professionals became far more accepting of them. It evolved into a formidable partnership. Over the course of the war, 38,000 VADs worked directly in hospitals, and many were decorated for distinguished service.
And this wasn't just a First World War phenomenon. The Inter promised we'd talk about the Second World War as well. Did the organization just pack up and go home in 1918?
Not at all. The organization adapted. During the interwar years, they maintained a presence, focusing on community health and disaster relief. But when the Second World War erupted in 1939, they mobilized again. However, the dynamic was different this time. The military had learned its lesson from 1914.
So they didn't try to ban them from the hospitals this time around?
No, they integrated them much more seamlessly into the armed forces' medical branches. During WWII, VADs were dealing with a completely different type of warfare. They were serving back home during the terror of the Blitz, dragging civilians out of bombed-out buildings in London.
Incredible bravery.
Absolutely. They were deployed overseas, again, from the Middle East to Asia. You had incredible leaders emerge during this era, like Dayman Bryans, who was appointed as the head of the Middle East Command for the VAD, coordinating vast logistical medical networks across an entire theater of war.
It really highlights how they fundamentally revolutionized military nursing. They proved that mass civilian volunteer models could be rapidly mobilized and integrated into formal military structures. They completely altered the logistical capabilities of the armed forces.
And beyond the logistics, they shifted societal gender norms permanently. They proved undeniably that women could handle complex administration, extreme physical labor, and severe psychological trauma at an industrial scale.
So, what does this all mean? It means that for a generation of women across 2 global conflicts, the Voluntary Aid Detachment served as a temporary, intense crucible. It completely altered the trajectory of their lives. But I want to go back to the end of the First World War for a moment. Once the armistice was signed in 1918, what happened to all these highly skilled, battle-tested VADs? Did they just transition into civilian nursing careers?
You would logically think so. But this is where the professional nurses had the last laugh. Despite the indispensable contributions of the VADs, the leaders of the professional nursing establishment drew a very hard line at the end of the war. They formally agreed that untrained VADs would absolutely not be allowed onto the newly established register of nurses.
Wait, really? Even after 4 years of frontline combat trauma care?
Even then, the establishment's view was that no matter how much battlefield experience a woman had, if she didn't complete the traditional formal academic training, the door to the professional registry was slammed shut. They were fiercely protecting their profession's credentials.
That is genuinely shocking. So you have tens of thousands of women who have just experienced the most profound, harrowing work of their lives, and they are essentially handed a thank you note and told to go back to sitting in their parlors.
But the thing is, you can't just put that genie back in the bottle. These women have been fundamentally changed. Because they were effectively barred from continuing as registered medical professionals, they took their newfound confidence, their resilience, and their worldliness, and they went on to make history in entirely different fields.
Which perfectly sets up some of the most fascinating trivia in this entire history. The ranks of the VAD are filled with some incredibly famous faces. We have some truly surprising alumni from this crucible.
The list of notable VAD alumni is essentially a cross-section of early 20th century excellence. Some of the names will absolutely shock you. For instance, Amelia Earhart.
No way.
Yes, long before she was a legendary aviation pioneer, she served as a VAD in Canada, treating wounded soldiers returning from the front.
That is incredible. And she wasn't the only household name. We also have Agatha Christie,
The iconic British mystery author herself. She actually utilized the deep knowledge of poisons and pharmaceuticals she gained in the hospital dispensary to write her famous murder mysteries.
That makes perfect sense.
We also see major literary figures like Vera Brittain, whose best-selling memoir Testament of Youth remains one of the most poignant, heartbreaking accounts of World War I. She worked at 5 different hospitals during her service.
I also read about Enid Bagnold in the accounts. She wrote the famous novel National Velvet, the one that was adapted into the 1944 film with Elizabeth Taylor. She actually wrote a deeply critical memoir about her time as a VAD called A Diary Without Dates. It ruffled so many feathers in the medical establishment that she was dismissed from the organization.
They did not take kindly to whistleblowers. But if we are talking about unbelievable life stories that intersect with the VAD, we have to talk about Violet Jessup. Her biography just jumps off the page.
Oh, this is my absolute favorite one from the source material. Tell the story.
Violet Jessup was an ocean liner stewardess. In 1912, she was working aboard the RMS Titanic when it struck the iceberg. She survived the sinking, floating in a lifeboat until she was rescued.
Which is a lifetime of trauma and drama all on its own.
But she doesn't stop. The First World War breaks out, and she volunteers to train as a VAD nurse. Because of her maritime background, the Red Cross assigns her to a hospital ship, and the ship they assign her to is the HMHS Britannic.
The literal sister ship to the Titanic.
Yes. And in 1916, while carrying wounded soldiers, the Britannic struck a deep-sea naval mine in the Aegean Sea. The ship sank in less than an hour, and Violet Jessup survived that sinking as well. She survived 2 of the most famous maritime disasters of the 20th century the second time while serving actively as a VAD nurse.
That is an astonishing level of resilience, and it perfectly encapsulates the spirit of the organization. Let's just rapid fire a few more notable names to show the breadth of talent. You have sportswomen like Lottie Dodd, a 5-time Wimbledon tennis champion who volunteered. You have pioneers like Aileen Preston, who became the head of the first autonomous British women's ambulance unit.
And you even have brilliant scientific minds like Marjorie Stevenson, a biochemist who eventually became one of the first 2 women ever elected to the prestigious Royal Society.
It was an incredible nexus point. You had suffragettes, painters, explorers, and future leaders all converging in these bloody, chaotic wards, unified by a desire to serve. When you step back and look at the entire arc of the Voluntary Aid Detachment, it is a story of profound, undeniable transformation. You have this massive group of wealthy civilian women who were initially dismissed outright by the patriarchal military establishment. They were told they were too delicate, too sheltered, and too emotionally fragile to be of any use in a real crisis. But they utterly refused to accept that narrative. And when the moment came, when the medical system was pushed to the absolute breaking point, they stepped into the abyss. They went from being restricted to boiling water to becoming indispensable, battle-hardened medics. They braved artillery fire, they endured unimaginable physical and emotional tolls, and they proved that courage and capability are not dictated by social class or gender.
That's beautifully said.
So the next time you are facing a massive new challenge, the next time you feel completely unqualified or someone tells you that you simply don't have the right background or credentials for the task at hand, I want you to remember the VADs. Remember the women who transformed from Edwardian socialites to combat medics overnight.
This raises an important question, though, and it's one that the history of the VAD highlights perfectly. We discussed how, despite their decorated service, despite mastering trauma care under the most grueling conditions imaginable, the professional nursing establishment ultimately banned these women from the professional register the moment the war ended. It leaves you wondering. In times of desperate crisis, society is so quick to celebrate the passionate, untrained volunteer who steps up to the plate. We rely on them to save the day. But once the dust settles and normalcy returns, why are we so quick to discard that battle-tested, real-world experience simply because it lacks a formal piece of paper?
That is a fascinating, complex thought to leave on. The tension between lived experience and formal credentials is very much something we are still navigating in our institutions today. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary history of the Voluntary Aid Detachment. It's been an absolute privilege exploring this story with you. Keep learning, keep questioning the world around you, and we will catch you next time.